Welcome to Inside Judicial Watch. My name is Jerry Dunleavy. I'm a digital strategist here with Judicial Watch, filling in for our Director of Communications, Carter Clews, who's on another assignment. So I'm very glad to be here. And I'm very glad to be joined by our Director of Investigations and Research, Chris Farrell. So thank you very much for joining me, sir.
Yeah, great to be here. Thanks.
So I brought you here today because I'd like to talk about the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau.
Sure.
Been in the news quite a bit lately because of the power struggle going on. The dueling acting directors, Mick Mulvaney, appointed by the President of the United States, and Leandra English, appointed by herself.
Yeah.
The outgoing director, Richard Cordray, sort of just appointing her over the wishes of the president. So kind of reminds me of the dueling popes of the 14th century. So I wanted to bring you on to get your take on what's been going on with the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau generally today, and then the long view on the problems surrounding the agency.
Sure.
So,
happy to do so.
I'd love it if you're able to dive into what we're doing.
Yeah, sure. Today. So, let's discuss the most recent controversy, because that's really what catapulted the agency into the news, and that is Richard Cordray, who's sort of the long-term chief of the Bureau, resigns. On the way out the door. He attempts to designate his successor, which in theory is okay, except that he doesn't really have that authority, and that authority rests with the president. That's not just the opinion of the president, it's the opinion of the Office of Legal Counsel, which is essentially the president's outside counsel, outside the White House counsel, from the Department of Justice. And even the General Counsel of CFPB says that the president has the authority to appoint the head of CFPB. Now, all of the leftists and the sort of activist folks who dreamed up CFPB, people like Elizabeth Warren and Nancy Pelosi and the rest, they will do anything and everything they possibly can to undermine the president's legitimate authority, because that's what they do. That's their larger ideological purpose. They can't get past their ideology. They can't say, look, we had an election and our person lost, so now we have to move on with business. They keep trying to do really kind of cheap shot tactics to in some way delegitimize the president. So Mr. Mulvaney comes in and assumes control, as he should, because the president said go do that, and he does. He is not a fan of CFPB. Frankly, no one with a few brain cells in their head would be a fan of CFPB. The example that I've used previously, and I'm a little sarcastic, but I really mean the intent of what I'm saying, and that is, to understand CFPB, think of HUD, Housing and Urban Development. Mm-hmm. Think of HUD on crack. Okay, that is what CFPB is. This is an agency that has no constitutional foundation whatsoever. They designed it to be unaccountable to the Congress. It doesn't draw its appropriations, its money, from the House of Representatives. It's the only government entity element that isn't funded by the House of Representatives.
And it gets its funding from
the Federal Reserve. Everyone's favorite.
Yes.
And there's no real oversight. They kind of do whatever they want. The problem is that they're not only incompetent with respect to their ability to manage their own finances, and I'll give you one example from documentation that we obtained.
Yep.
They were supposed to do a renovation of their office space,
mm-hmm.
and they had budgeted $50 million to do it. They went $93 million over that.
Right.
And so they spent more than double of what they were originally authorized. But they're supposed to be, watchdogs for the consumer.
Right.
This is insanity. They're not even watchdogs for the taxpayer, let alone the consumer. And so it's an agency that's literally out of control, with no real sort of adult leadership, that has this broad sort of self-appointed, self-enacting mandate. They decide what they're going to do and not do.
So let's talk.
Yeah, I could keep going, but I'll run out of oxygen.
So let's talk for a second about what they are supposed to do. What was the original supposed concept here? Why were they
Right.
Why was this organization formed to begin with?
Okay.
What was this in response
So
to?
if you're wandering around the mind of Elizabeth Warren, and
Yes.
that's really the great first advocate of CFPB, then you're channeling FDR, right? That's kind of the mindset, and so it's this sort of soft socialism that progressively gets harder and harder. And so Elizabeth Warren is concerned that evil capitalists will exploit the workers, right? I mean, that's really where she's coming from. Mm-hmm. And that's the thought process behind the need to create a bureau to protect consumers. I'm not sure what they're protecting them from, other than this notion that evil capitalists will in some way take advantage of the poor, stupid citizenry. And so I guess, the outcome of that, the worst case scenario, is that their rulemaking, their activities essentially turn banks into utilities. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's the most devastating thing. They insert themselves and generate regulations to make business more difficult to do. They pick winners and losers. They target businesses that are entirely legitimate and lawful, but that they don't like because it doesn't align with their social view. Only FDR could have only dreamed of this kind of level of, government manufactured, centralized state control kind of stuff. And so that's the Reader's Digest version of CFPB.
So let's talk about that in practice, because Judicial Watch did a number of FOIA lawsuits over the years, a bunch of investigations. We found a lot of different things. And what intrigued me the most was the data collection that CFPB is doing.
Yeah.
I was looking at one of our reports where, for instance, we obtained records from the CFPB showing they spend millions of dollars for warrantless collection, analyzing Americans' financial transactions.
Let me glom onto that for a second.
Yeah, go for it.
So let's think about this. People became hysterical, rightly so in some respects, over warrantless wiretaps.
Right.
And
from the NSA.
Correct.
Yeah.
And that isn't necessarily an entirely accurate description of what the NSA does with respect to wiretaps. I don't want to get into the semantics of that, but the notion was that there was this warrantless, meaning they had never gone before a judge to get a warrant. There was no underlying sworn declaration from a law enforcement officer identifying a crime and the likelihood of the suspect having committed it and the reason why the evidence was needed.
Right.
That's the procedural steps to get a warrant, right?
Right.
None of that was ever established. It was just this, these guys might be doing something, so we better go look at them. And people became hysterical, rightly so, over the notion that there's this broad, sweeping kind of vacuuming up every electron that's out there kind of thing.
Right.
What they didn't do was become equally as hysterical when CFPB started vacuuming up every financial transaction.
Right.
And I would argue that that is far more intrusive than you calling Aunt Barbara to wish her happy birthday.
Right.
There's nothing terribly, you're just being a nice guy and you're calling your aunt to say happy birthday, right? There's no there. But what you spend your money on and how you spend your money and sort of all those, your FICA score of, what your credit rating is and the Fair Credit Reporting Act and all these requirements under the law about consumer privacy were just thrown out the window because CFPB is a big data operation.
Right.
They suck up all this info without any warrant, tracking down to the card swipe.
Yeah.
Consumers' activities, behaviors, spending patterns. There was this large document that had like 96 different fields in it, one of which was they were running people's credit. They could see that, let's say you had a Visa card with a $10,000 limit. They were tracking to see how close you got to your limit, how often you made payments. Were you paying just the minimum? Or did you try to knock down your debt and pay, maybe your minimum payment's $50 and you decide to pay $500 because you want to knock down the pending balance so your interest rate goes down, you owe less. That's the level of detail that they were doing. and people have no idea.
Right. So when we were talking about the NSA, we were talking more about metadata type stuff. When we're talking about the CFPB, we're talking about the nitty gritty. We're talking about very specific financial transactions from millions of Americans.
I mean, it's just creepy.
Back in 2014, a federal audit basically confirmed a lot of what Judicial Watch had found. The collections of hundreds of millions of dollars of credit card accounts.
Yep.
Which is pretty incredible. Now, they said that they were collecting that information in order to run sort of, what was it, to run tests, to figure out people's...
They're going to help you.
Yeah.
Right. They're always there to help you.
Right.
I mean,
right.
Look, you can come up with all sorts of excuses, and you can say, well, we're doing this for the greater good or whatever else. But this is the government being wildly intrusive, not just to the consumers who are out there, spending too much at Christmas or whatever it is, or borrowing beyond what they really should be doing.
Yeah.
But it's the flip side too. It's what businesses are on the receiving end of these transactions, right? So it's wildly invasive. There wasn't a single warrant. It's all Obama and the whole leftist, Soviet advancing this agenda, and you did not hear a peep from the conventional media, whether it's the Washington Post, CNN, blah, blah, blah. Not a word out of them. It was only Judicial Watch digging this stuff up.
Right.
A few members of Congress paid attention. They objected. But largely, this was a snoozer. Nobody paid any attention, and everyone was busy yelling about other issues.
And why do you think that is? Why hasn't this gained the sort of traction that you would think?
Well, I mean, in large part, it's because there's this sort of state-sponsored media thing, right? In large part, there's not a lot of intellectual curiosity or honesty about the fact that if you're hysterical over metadata, how about the card swipe of every American purchasing anything, and what their running credit limits are? You talk about invasive. And no one paid attention to it.
Right.
And now that it's been done for a while, guess what? How hard do you think it is to turn off?
I'm assuming that it's probably going to be pretty difficult to
You are
to
correct.
stop.
It's virtually impossible. I mean, it can be done, but it is an uphill battle because the answer is, well, we've always done that.
Right.
And stopping the government from doing something that it's always done, and it's for your own good. We know better than you. I mean, that's really the mindset. Reversing that is very, very difficult. I mean, for example, when President Trump came into office, why didn't they just kill the agency?
Right.
Why even staff it? Turn their internet off. See what happens. I mean, nothing precludes them from doing that.
Yeah.
I know that people would be hysterical running around screaming that it's the end of the world and, the republic is at stake or something, but it's nonsense.
So, of course, part of the problem with stopping any government agency is once the bureaucracy starts to get in motion, once there's momentum, it's hard to stop, like you said. But I think part of the problem with this agency is the way it's structured, right? It's an independent agency, right? And I'm a bit of a nerd, and so I went through the...
We know that.
Thank you. I probably didn't have to declare that, but this... The CFPB was actually brought to court, all the way up to the United States Court of Appeals here in D.C.
Right.
And the Court of Appeals kind of struck down a lot of the way that it, well, at least critiqued, not necessarily struck down, but critiqued a lot of the way that it was set up. Because the way that the CFPB is set up is an incredible amount of power is placed in the director of the CFPB, and if you'll indulge me,
go for it.
The U.S. Court of Appeals here in D.C. Said just very briefly, because the CFPB is an independent agency headed by a single director, the director of the CFPB possesses more unilateral authority than any single commissioner or board member in any other independent agency in the U.S. government. Indeed, the director enjoys more unilateral authority than any other officer in any of the three branches of the U.S. government other than the president. So this is a powerful agency. So not only is it able to collect the financial information of hundreds of millions of Americans, but the person who runs this agency can pretty much do what he wants.
Which is why you saw the hysterical theatrics from the left and this woman, Ms. English, running into court trying to make this phony claim about, oh, we have to stop this, and that's why. Because they know how much authority and power. That's why they're not going to scream about who's going to be the head of customs in New York City or whatever, but they will about who's CFPB chief.
Wow. So where do you see this going? I mean, so Mulvaney is now the acting director.
He is.
What direction do you see this going?
He's placed a freeze on everything, which is a good first start.
Yeah.
There's 1,600 employees there that probably need to go someplace else and find a home. Mm-hmm. And if I was, president or CFPB chief or whatever, I'd just disband the operation.
Just like that.
Why not? It's not going to get any better with time.
And what do you think the chances of that happening under this president are?
I think pretty good. I mean, it could happen. It may not happen, at the speed or with the smooth path, but I think it could happen.
All right. Well, I definitely appreciate all of your insights here. Do you have any closing words or anything like that you'd like to share?
It's wonderful to be here and interview, and it's always fun to talk about our work.
All right. Well, thanks for being here, and thanks for joining us for this episode of Inside Judicial Watch.